By the spring of 1942, Adolf Hitler had arrived at a strategic certainty. The 2,685-kilometre Atlantic coastline of occupied Europe would become his salvation. The result was the Atlantic Wall. 15,000 permanent fortifications, steel gun emplacements sunk into coastal bluffs, artillery batteries ranging 15 kilometres offshore, millions of mines, and kilometres of wire, concrete walls 3.5 metres thick, real guns, bore-sighted on real water. But the Atlantic Wall was not a wall. It was a necklace, a series of fixed points connected by a fiction. In October 1943, Generalfeldmarschall Erwin Rommel was given command of Army Group B and tasked with inspecting the coastal defences. He had just come from North Africa, from his own defeat, and he knew things about the gap between official reports and operational reality that Hitler's headquarters had not absorbed. What he found appalled him. The fixed fortifications existed, and some were impressive. But between them, across the long stretches of beach and headland, there was almost nothing. Wire, yes, some mines, but no depth, no integrated system of strongpoints covering each other's flanks, no mobile reserve positioned to intervene before a beachhead could be consolidated. Rommel understood something critical. He had watched in Africa what Allied air power did to moving columns of armour. He thought about what it would mean to face that same air power in France. And he reached a conclusion that was both correct and, in the institutional context of the German High Command, almost impossible to implement. If the Allies were not defeated on the beaches, they would not be defeated at all. This was not defeatism. It was arithmetic. The arithmetic of air superiority, strategic bombing, and the growing disparity in industrial production. Every day an invasion force was allowed to consolidate on French soil was a day in which material weight would begin to tip towards the attackers. The panzer divisions had to stand close to the shore. They had to be authorized to move within hours. Otherwise, nothing. Generalfeldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, held the opposite view with equal conviction. A Prussian of the old school, a veteran of the First World War, he looked at the map of France and saw what classical European military doctrine had taught him to see. Von Rundstedt believed the invasion could not be stopped on the beaches. The coastline was too long, the forces too thinly dispersed. The correct strategy: allow the Allies to land, exhaust them fighting through the coastal defences, identify the main blow, then deliver a concentrated armoured counterattack in the classic operational tradition. This was the doctrine of the elastic defence. It had worked on the Eastern Front. It was the doctrine of manoeuvre warfare. Von Rundstedt was not wrong. He was wrong about the conditions required for his doctrine to function. The elastic defence required the ability to move reserves. Movement required roads and railways. Roads and railways in the summer of 1944 required freedom from Allied air interdiction. The Allied strategic bombers had spent April through June systematically destroying the French railway network. Bridges were down. Marshalling yards were rubble. The roads were watched by typhoons and P-47s given exactly one job. Von Rundstedt's doctrine assumed conditions that no longer existed. He did not know this yet. Hitler resolved the dispute between his two senior commanders by splitting the difference. 3 panzer divisions went to Army Group B under Rommel. The rest of the armoured reserve, including the powerful Panzerlehr and the 12th SS Panzer, remained in OKW reserve, meaning they could only be committed on Hitler's personal authority. The armour Rommel needed at the beaches sat in assembly areas, waiting for a telephone call that might not come until the tide had already turned. There was one further element without which nothing makes sense. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. They knew it would come somewhere along the northwest coast of France. What they did not know, what they were through one of history's most successful deception operations, prevented from knowing, was where. Operation Fortitude built a fictional army group supposedly under General Patton, positioned opposite the Pas de Calais, fed through double agents entirely under British control. German intelligence became increasingly convinced the Pas de Calais was the primary target. The defences there were the strongest. The 15th Army, positioned to defend that sector, was the most powerful German formation in the West. Normandy, by contrast, was held by the 7th Army, competent but stretched. Nobody in the German High Command that night was looking at Normandy. At 0:16 on June 6, 1944, American paratroopers began falling over the Cotentin Peninsula. They were scattered across 30 kilometers of hedgerow-divided fields, flooded valleys, and small Norman villages. Almost none of them where their maps said they should be. To German defenders, this looked initially like a gift. Isolated men without heavy weapons, often without officers, frequently without any sense of where they were. What it actually was, what the German command failed to appreciate, was a general disruption of their communications in the critical hours before first light. At 2 o'clock, Rommel's chief of staff was hosting a small gathering at Army Group B headquarters. Rommel himself was not present. Persuaded by favourable weather forecasts, he had left France 2 days earlier to visit his family and press Hitler once more for the Panzer Reserves. Rommel was in Germany when the Allies landed in France. Hitler, at 2 o'clock on June 6th, was asleep. His staff had standing orders he was not to be woken for anything less than a confirmed crisis. The reports from France were confused and contradictory. The duty officers at OKW were not prepared to wake the Führer on the basis of an unclear picture. Hitler was not woken until nearly 10 o'clock that morning. By then, American infantry had been fighting on Omaha Beach for 5 hours. The request to release the Panzer Reserve was not approved until late afternoon. Panzer Lehr, ordered to move by road to Normandy, began its march in daylight. By nightfall on June 7th, its commander, General Bayerlein, estimated his division had lost approximately 130 vehicles to air attack before firing a single shot at Allied ground forces. On Omaha Beach, the planning assumptions collapsed within the first hour. The pre-invasion bombardment overshot by nearly 3 kilometers. Bomb loads fell on fields and farmhouses, leaving German defensive positions essentially intact. Of the 32 duplex-drive Sherman tanks meant to swim ashore ahead of the infantry, 27 sank in rough channel waters. Their crews drowned, and the defenders were not the static, lower-quality division Allied intelligence had identified. The veteran 352nd Infantry Division had moved into the Omaha sector undetected. Experienced soldiers with positions sighted to deliver enfilading fire along every meter of beach. The men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions came ashore into a prepared killing ground. 200 meters of firm sand, fully exposed, under fire from elevated positions on both flanks. Corpses accumulated at the waterline. Radio communications failed. Company commanders died in the first minutes. General Omar Bradley, observing from the cruiser Augusta, contemplated evacuation. He did not give the order. By nightfall, sergeants and junior officers had led groups of men off the beach and up the bluffs by routes that were not on any map, that had not been planned, that existed only because a man with a weapon had decided to move in a direction that was not directly toward the German guns. The beachhead was shallow, in places no more than 2 kilometers deep. But it existed. Meanwhile, the 15th Army sat north of the Seine and did not move. German intelligence, still fed by compromised double agents, concluded that Normandy was a large-scale diversion. The main blow, Fusag under Patton, had not yet been committed. For 6 weeks, while the battle for Normandy ground through the hedgerows, a substantial portion of the German strategic reserve remained fixed by a fiction. By the time OKW accepted that Normandy was the main invasion, 500,000 Allied troops had been landed, and the operational situation had moved beyond recovery. Operation COBRA launched on July 25, 1944, after 2,500 Allied aircraft dropped 4,200 tons of bombs on a rectangle of Norman farmland. The bombardment was imprecise. Friendly fire killed 111 American soldiers, including a lieutenant general. Some German positions survived, but the defensive capacity of Panzer Lehr in the bomb zone was not merely reduced, it was shattered. Of approximately 3,400 men in the frontline positions, perhaps 1,000 remained capable of resistance when American infantry moved forward. General J. Lawton Collins's 7th Corps pushed through the gap. What followed is sometimes called a breakthrough. It was more accurately an unraveling. The German line had been held together by tactical skill, terrain advantage, and an armoured reserve used in entirely the wrong way. Once penetrated, once Allied armour reached open ground behind the German positions, there was no depth. The Atlantic Wall had been the defence. When it was gone, there was nothing behind it. Patton's Third Army, activated August 1st, reached Avranches within a week, turned into Brittany, then swung east behind the German 7th Army. The encirclement that closed at Falaise in mid-August trapped the better part of 40 divisions. Tens of thousands killed. Hundreds of tanks lost. The accumulated equipment of an army group abandoned in the fields of Normandy. Paris was liberated on August 25th. By September, Allied forces stood at the German border. The battle that was supposed to decide the fate of the Reich had lasted 80 days and ended in a rout. After the war, the surviving German generals wrote their memoirs. A pattern emerged. The analysis had been sound. The defeat was Hitler's fault. His split of the Panzer Reserve, his refusal to release it promptly, his insistence on the Pas-de-Calais fiction. Had the armour been positioned as Rommel wanted, the battle might have gone differently. This argument is not entirely wrong. Hitler's command centralization was genuinely disastrous. The decisions about the Panzer Reserve were genuinely catastrophic. But the argument obscures the deeper truth. The Atlantic Wall failed not because of Hitler's interference, though that made a bad situation worse. It failed because the Germans were defending 2,685 kilometers of coastline, with forces insufficient to hold even a fraction of it against a determined assault with air superiority. It failed because the transportation plan had already destroyed the conditions under which armoured counterattack doctrine could function. It failed because fortitude was brilliant, and German intelligence was compromised, and the battle was lost, in a meaningful sense, before the first man crossed the Channel. The distinction is the entire point. You cannot design a static defence against a mobile attacker with air superiority, deception capabilities, and material production 3 times your own, and then attribute the failure to tactical decisions made in the hours after the landing. The wall was built to hold the wrong war. The Allies earned their landing with years of preparation, deception, and industrial production. With the transportation plan, which spent months destroying the French rail network before a soldier crossed the Channel. With fortitude, which required the sustained coordination of every British intelligence agency over years. With the lives of men who drowned in cold water during training exercises. With the men who died on Omaha Beach in the first 20 minutes. Nobody gives you anything. You have to earn it. The answer in June 1944 came from the sea.